Thoughts create neural pathways. Repeated thoughts strengthen certain perspectives. If we constantly tell ourselves this is miserable, we enhance that belief. We reinforce that belief. Constantly telling ourselves this is awesome, we're going to seek out evidence to support our claim that this is awesome. Welcome to the Grateful Podcast with Jack Wagoner, where each and every week we explore what it takes to live a life full of purpose and gratitude. I'm your host, Jack Wagoner, and I am a deep believer in what I call the duality of gratitude and relentless action toward your goals. That's where we can feel grateful for what we have in this moment right now while pursuing something bigger and better in the future. And that's the way I like to live, and that is what we talk about here on the Grateful Podcast. The Grateful Podcast with Jack Wagoner presents. Subscribe. How much of our reality is a direct result of the stories we tell ourselves? I'd say a lot. Recently, I was going on a run. It was -2 degrees outside. Everything was frozen. My breath was just a cloud in the air I was running into. And yet I was having a blast. I was smiling. I realized that what I was doing was impacting my future, and I could not have been more happy to be in the moment. The joy I felt was immaculate. Just 2 mornings later, it was nearly the same temperature out. Almost identical situations. And yet, I hated it. I hated it so much. Why? With nearly identical external circumstances, my reality was starkly contrasting. The contrast between a moment of peak experience and a moment of absolute dread was all rooted in my own perception of what was in front of me. It was all rooted in how I perceived the moment and the feelings I had during that moment. Or at least that's what I thought. That's what I hypothesized. So I went on this quest, I guess. Wasn't that big of a quest, but to find out what the real reason behind this difference in perception was. If you're like me, I'm just deeply fascinated in life in general and how we live our lives. And I think that it would be a huge understanding in my life and just aid in my life if I understood why we feel the way we do about certain moments. How much sense would it make or how helpful would it be if there was a way for you to consciously choose how you perceived a moment? And even if it wasn't 100% guaranteed that you could make this moment joyful, if it was a moment of just atrocity, I bet we could get pretty darn close. And so I started to understand that the quote by, I'm going to butcher her name, but Anais Nin, I think we've all heard it, but we see the world not as it is, but as we are. Just absolutely phenomenal to me. So I dove into the science of it because, again, I think it would be really helpful to us in general to just understand why we perceive reality in the way we do. Think about that person at the grocery store that's always super nice to you. You're checking out and they're super kind. And then there's also that person in the aisle right next to them that's a grump, is a grouch. They have nearly the exact same job, but one of them loves it and the other one seemingly just detests their circumstances, detests their life. Why? So, Anais Nin would have said it's because of who they are. The external circumstances are the same, but their internal circumstances are different. So it led me into digging into the science of perception and mindset. Our brains are meant to make meaning of things. So our RAS, our reticular activating system, is what filters what we focus on. I found this interesting. So if we expect something to be difficult or unpleasant, our brain finds evidence to support that expectation. So we focus on things that confirm our belief systems going into that moment. Confirmation bias, something I bet you've heard of, a simpler explanation of that. We look for things that confirm what we already believe. An example, the placebo effect. Patients given a sugar pill sometimes experience real effects simply because they believe that they're taking real medicine. We construct a reality parallel to our belief systems going into that experience. A 2007 Harvard study found that hotel maids lost more weight when they believed their daily work counted as exercise, even though their routines didn't change. So believing that what you're doing is something that we say is able to help us lose weight, help these people lose weight, even though they were doing the same exact thing as before, just that belief system that is enhanced by a societal norm. That's fascinating. So this leads me on to neuroplasticity and just thought reframing. Our thoughts create neural pathways. Repeated thoughts strengthen certain perspectives. If we constantly tell ourselves this is miserable, as I said before, we enhance that belief. We reinforce that belief. Constantly telling ourselves this is awesome, we're going to seek out evidence to support our claim that this is awesome. Our brains are really good at the scientific method. If we reframe discomfort as a growth or excitement, we reshape our natural response. So psychologists use what's called, or there's a psychological tool called cognitive reappraisal. People who practice reframing their experiences will experience less stress and anxiety. So reframing that this is awful to this is awesome might be a very, very extreme case. But for example, um, still extreme but less extreme, Olympic athletes often feel the same physiological reactions as nervousness with the racing heart or adrenaline, but they reframe that as excitement. So you don't necessarily have to reframe something you previously would have thought of as horrible as awesome. That's an extreme shift. But reframing something you feel and associate with a certain emotion, certain negative emotion, as a positive thing, reframing that to associate it with a positive thing, can really help shift your actual reaction. So, I Jay Shetty likes to talk about um, the battle of the two minds, monk mind versus monkey mind. Your monkey mind is your reactive, survival focused mind. It wants to avoid discomfort. And your monk mind is the calm, intentional, growth focused mind. Now, other people have reframed this as your upper and lower brain. So that's something often talked about in this book, Behind the Principles by Ray Dalio, or also psychologists and neuroscientists have talked about how evolutionarily we had a certain lower mind and then have grown a outer layer as we've advanced as a species. Some of this upper lower mind, monkey mind stuff has been um, noted as more is not quite real by neuroscientists and psychologists. So I'm going to be careful on what I say. Um, but I think that as a concept, conceptually, the monk mind and monkey mind are things we can relate to. So even if on a scientific level, we don't have two different monk mind, monkey minds, I think that it's something that we can all relate to, and it's a way of characterizing these experiences we have. So um, evolutionarily, heading back to the monkey mind, discomfort meant danger, right? So when you were uncomfortable, that often meant that you were in danger, and you need to find comfort to then be able to reproduce and continue the species. In modern life, discomfort almost always doesn't mean death, but our brain still reacts as if it does. If we only act when we feel like it, we reinforce the habit of waiting for motivation. That's the thing about this evolutionary monkey mind, right? If we only act when we feel like it, like I said, we reinforce the habit of waiting for motivation. But it's what our evolutionary mind wants us to do. So how do we break the cycle? There's a quote by Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. When we take control of the narrative, we take control of our experience. So here's some practical strategies that will help you shift perspective. If you're enjoying this episode of the Grateful Podcast, I would very much appreciate it if you could either share this podcast episode with friends and family, or kindly leave a review down below on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. It would help me be able to make this podcast better for you, better for all my other listeners. Thank you. Enjoy the show. I have 3 questions I like to ask myself when I'm facing resistance. So, for example, taking us back to that run I had, the second run where it felt really hard, right? I had to think to myself, why am I miserable right now? I felt 2 days earlier like I was doing well. Well, I didn't do this at that time, but if I could go back, I would ask these 3 questions. 1, it felt effortless last time. What's different now? 2, what story am I telling myself about this moment? 3, what happens if I just let go and be present right now? These are fantastic. Because that first one, it's getting curious with myself. It felt effortless last time. What's different now? It's not getting angry that it's different now. It's getting curious. It's asking, trying to diagnose the problem, trying to diagnose why is something feeling different. I think so often our response is reactionary. So if you know you're able to do something and right now you can't do it, or if something felt great previously and right now it feels bad, we get mad at ourselves for being in that situation, for experiencing what we're experiencing in that way. For example, a common thing is to be trying to sleep and struggling to fall asleep and getting mad at yourself for struggling to fall asleep, even though that's just not helping the problem at all. So instead of that, you can say, what is different right now? What is a common fact, or what is a different factor between right now where I feel anxious or uncomfortable, I hate what I'm doing, and what's the difference between that and when I'm really joyful? It may be simple, it may be hard, it may be a big difference, it may be a really small difference, but understanding the difference is key. The what story am I telling myself about this moment? That's huge for me. I think that's my favorite one, because you found that difference, right? But the difference could just be the way that your narrative is experiencing this moment, the narrative that you have of this moment. When I was on that run, I was telling myself from the moment I woke up that this was going to be hard, that this was going to suck. I hated the cold. I hit the cold air when I walked out the door, and I was like, oh my God, it's so cold. Instead of being like, whoa, that woke me up. That feels good. Even though I didn't really feel that way, consciously just saying that out loud and putting that energy out there would change the way I felt about it. So what story are you telling yourself in this moment where you don't feel as good, as opposed to when you did feel good, doing the same thing? And 3, what happens if I just let go and be here? Easier said than done, right? just letting go, being present, words we hear all the time. It's not easy to do. What I recommend is just hyper focus on the action at hand. On that run, if I wanted to let go of that inner dialogue saying that it was really hard in my mind, what I should have done is just focus on every step. Focus on the way my heel was hitting the ground before my toes. That's what meditation is. A lot of like mindfulness meditation concentration meditation is just concentrating. That's one of the most common meditation practices. So to bring that meditative presence into your daily life, you just have to hyper focus on one thing. Your brain can't focus intensely on multiple things at once. So if you put all of your focus into one thing, the rest of the world will dissipate. All right, so here's some methods to reframe the discomfort that we're experiencing. You can detach. So what that means is you can observe your thoughts instead of identifying with them. This is a huge, huge Buddhist thing. I'm actually reading this book right now. It's called Why Buddhism is True. I really recommend it. Really recommend you read it. Super good. But they talk about detachment in that. A big part of meditation and feeling calm is being able to recognize that you are not your thoughts. Being able to detach your identity from the thoughts that you're having, especially if they're negative, will allow you to lock in and experience the moment in joy and bliss. Another thing is a gratitude shift. So I hear this all the time, right? It's a pretty saturated concept, but instead of saying I have to do this, shift to I get to do this. That first day I was on the run, when I really loved it, I was so just joyful in the moment. I was able, how lucky am I? I thought to myself that I'm able to get up when I want to and go for a run and just do something that's great for my body. How lucky am I? Instead of, I gotta go run again. You kidding me? Like, it's hard to feel the first way, but expressing the latter emotion is also a choice. So if you're going to express emotion, express it positively. And then another huge technique that I've found is just surrendering. So let go of your resistance to this negative experience and just, or what you framed as a negative experience. Instead, just surrender to the moment, go with it, let it engulf you, and you'll feel better. You can't control, having an internal locus of control is really important in this moment, because in a moment of difficulty, because you can't control the external circumstances that are causing you pain or hardship, but you can just go with them, ride with the punches, ride the wave, see where it takes you, and be okay with it. An example for this is Navy SEALs. SEALs train to override discomfort through breath control and mental reframing. But so they're focusing on something and reframing how they think about it, but they're also, another big part of this is that they're not changing the circumstances around them, they're changing what they're doing, right? So instead of getting mad at the circumstances around them, they're reframing how they think about it, they're going with the flow, and they're focusing on their breath. David Goggins' 40% rule is another thing I wanted to add in here, even though it's different from what we've been talking about. Goggins says, when you think you're done, you're actually only 40% of the way there. So if you're experiencing discomfort, just know that you have a long way to go before you can actually quit. Or you should actually quit. Next run that I'm feeling any discomfort, I'm definitely going to take everything I just said and implement that into my mindset. And I encourage you guys, if you're listening, to do the same thing. Next time you feel a moment of discomfort or any difficult emotion, just use some of the techniques I presented today and try to reframe it as a moment of joy, even if you're not feeling joyful. A lot of times I make these episodes to just talk to myself and reinforce certain ideas, but I hope you guys find it helpful. A final thought I have is that we can control how we perceive a moment and therefore how much joy we get from life. It isn't easy, but it's definitely worth it. It is so worth it. All right. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Grateful Podcast. I have some amazing guests coming on in the next few weeks. Hope you stay tuned. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to the Grateful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you could either share this episode with friends and family who you think would enjoy it, or leave a review down below on what I can do to make this better for you and for other listeners. All that would just help me be able to spread my message of gratitude and living a purposeful life. I hope you have a great day. See you soon.